There is a particular stillness that settles into you after the 40th checkpoint. Not calm. I want to be clear about the difference. Calm is something you choose, something you carry through a door like a lantern in your own hand. What I had by the time I reached Port Candescent was not calm. It was the stillness of a thing worn too smooth to catch on anything. I had been processed through 40 transit gates in 11 months, and somewhere around gate 23 I had stopped being a person who crossed borders and started being a border crossing event, a recurring administrative fact, a file that arrived before I did. The file said, Vaerith Selen, status, exile flagged, rank, none of record, species Vilhari. Homeworld, Selen Reach, currently under contested governance, security tier, elevated review required. Contact restriction, pending clearance from Warlord Athan Drevan's governance compact. The files did not say what I had been before Drevan's people rewrote it. The file did not say the rank had been stripped in a closed session lasting 40 minutes, that the legal instrument stripping it had been signed by 3 of Drevan's own bench-sitters, and witnessed by no one from my family line, because my family line had been given 12 hours to scatter. The file did not say that the exile flag was a standard suppression tool, applied to anyone whose presence in any neutral port might allow them to speak to a galactic diplomatic channel before Drevan's people could get there first. The file said what Drevan's people needed it to say. That was the point of the file. At 39 checkpoints, the file had done its work. I would enter the processing hall. I would take a number. I would sit on a bench that was designed to be marginally uncomfortable, not painful, not abusive, just uncomfortable enough to remind you that you were a transient problem to be solved. And I would wait. An officer would call the number. The officer would read the file. The officer would spend between 90 seconds and 4 minutes processing me, which in practice meant confirming that the file said what it said, checking that I had not acquired new contraband or new outstanding warrants in the 6 weeks since the last gate, and issuing a transit continuation stamp that allowed me to keep moving. The stamp was not permission to arrive anywhere in particular. It was permission to keep being in transit, is a legal category that exists specifically for people whom no one is willing to officially receive, but whom no one has grounds to officially detain. I was in that category. I had been in it for 11 months. You learn its geography the way you learn a room you sleep in by necessity, not fondly but precisely. At no checkpoint had any officer, after setting down the file, looked up and said anything to me that was not a procedural question. I tell you this not for sympathy. I am Vilhari. We were a warrior caste for 11 generations before Drevan's expansion swallowed the reach, and we do not ask for sympathy, and would not know what to do with it if it arrived. I tell you this so that what happened at Port Candescent makes sense. Because if I do not establish what the preceding 40 checkpoints felt like, 41st will not mean what it meant. The contrast is the story. The contrast is the whole of it. Candescent sits at the edge of what the interstellar transit maps call the Vethari margin, a strip of contested space that no major governance compact has successfully annexed, which means it survives by processing people that the major compacts would prefer to keep moving. Port itself is old. The stone of the exterior walls is a deep reddish-brown, the color of iron ore, and the desert wind has been at it for long enough that the corners are rounded. Inside, Processing Hall has 42 stations, and a commissary at the far end that serves 3 items at any hour: a hot grain porridge, a flatbread, and something that was probably tea. The benches are the same kind as every other port, marginally uncomfortable by some universal standard of transit architecture that I had come to find almost darkly funny. Somewhere in the history of interstellar settlement, someone had determined the exact degree of discomfort required to keep transit populations from becoming comfortable, and that measurement had apparently been published and adopted as gospel. I took number 87 from the dispenser. There were perhaps 30 people waiting, a mix of species, most of them carrying the same flat patience I had learned to wear. I found a bench near the processing stations, sat and set my travel case between my feet. I had long since stopped looking around these halls with anything like alertness. There was nothing to see that I had not already seen. I was watching my hands when Station 4 was called and the number matched mine. I stood, picked up the case and went. The officer at Station 4 was human. This registered to me only as information, the way the color of a wall registers, noted and filed. I had been processed by humans at 11 of the previous 40 checkpoints. They were not significantly different from any other species in how they handled the file. The file was the file. It did its work regardless of who was reading it. He was older than I expected. Most transit officers in the contested margins are young. The postings do not attract officers with seniority, and the work itself wears youth down quickly. This one was not young. His hair was dark with a significant amount of gray worked through it, short, and he had the kind of face that had been weathered by something more prolonged than mere age. Not battered, not hardened the way a combat face goes hard, but settled in the way stone settles when it has been in a landscape long enough to belong to it. He wore the Port Authority uniform with the particular ease of someone who has worn a uniform for decades and has no relationship with it beyond practicality. He took my documentation without looking up. I set it on the ledge between us. He opened the transit file. He read it. I stood. I had learned to stand during processing with my weight distributed evenly, my case at my side, my eyes on the middle distance. Not submission. I want to be clear about that too. Not submission, but the specific posture of someone who has learned that any other posture tends to extend the processing time. Officers read tension in posture. They read watchfulness as potential threat. I had calibrated myself to read as nothing. He was still reading. This was already longer than most. The file was not long. It was a suppression document. Suppression documents are not long, by design. They are written to be processed quickly, by people who will not read closely. He was reading closely. I became aware of this the way you become aware of a change in air pressure. Not because anything alarming had happened, because something different was happening, and difference, after 11 months, had a particular quality of alertness to it. He set the file down. He looked up. He had calm brown eyes. That is a bland thing to say, but I say it because it was the first thing that registered. Not the uniform, not the processing station, not the file. His eyes were calm in a way that was not incurious. There is a difference between eyes that are not looking at you and eyes that are looking at you steadily enough that they are not in a hurry to have seen everything. His were the second kind. He said, Varith Solen. That was it, just my name. Not the exile designation, not the file number, not the security tier classification. My name. 2 words spoken the way a person speaks a name they have read carefully and are now saying aloud to confirm they have the sound of it right. I said, yes. He said, this documentation is from Drevan's Governance Compact. Yes. Their jurisdiction in the Vithari margin is contested. Yes. He considered this, not in the way of an officer consulting procedure. I had seen that. It has a specific quality of internal navigation, a reaching for the manual quality. He was considering it the way a person considers a thing that bothers them and is honest enough not to pretend otherwise. He said, how long have you been traveling? I said, 11 months. How many gates? 40. Something moved in his face. Not pity. I would have noticed pity and catalogued it with the institutional discomfort of the benches. Another feature of transit life I had no use for. It was something else, a kind of reckoning. The look of someone who has just understood the dimensions of a thing they did not know they needed to understand. He said, have you eaten today? Had not. I did not say so, I said. That is not a procedural question. He said, no, it isn't. He picked up the file again. He stamped the transit continuation, as the 40 checkpoint officers before him had done. He slid it back through the partition. Then he said, the commissary is at the far end. The porridge is better than it looks. If you have a few minutes before your departure window, it's worth having. The file. I looked at him. He had already turned to pull up the next case. Not in dismissal, in the unhurried way of someone who has said what they intended to say and is not waiting to be thanked for it. I did not go to the commissary. I went back to the bench and sat with the case between my feet and the stamped file in my hands. I sat there for 4 minutes, which is not a long time, but which felt longer than usual because something had shifted in the way the hall felt, and I was trying to calibrate what it was. Nothing dramatic had happened. He had read my name. He had asked about food. He had stamped the document like every officer before him. And yet, I went to the commissary. The porridge was, as he had said, better than it looked. It was hot and had been made with some kind of seed grain I did not recognize. And there was a spiced oil drizzled across it that was warm in the back of the throat. I sat at one of the commissary tables, also the uncomfortable standard kind, and ate. I had not sat and eaten at a commissary since checkpoint 19, when I had still been in the habit of allowing myself small, stationary moments. Somewhere around checkpoint 23, I had started eating ration bars in transit corridors because it was faster, and I had learned to spend as little time as possible in any space where standing still might invite scrutiny. I was most of the way through the porridge when I heard the chair across from me move. I looked up. The human officer sat down across from me. He had a cup of whatever the tea was. He was still in uniform, but his shift must have ended or been handed off, because he had the posture of someone not currently on the clock. Slightly less formal, not unprofessional, just not oriented toward the station. He said, "I hope this isn't an intrusion. You can tell me if it is. I considered this. Velhari do not, as a matter of culture, place a premium on social indirection. We have a saying that translates roughly as, if a thing is worth saying, it is worth saying in the daylight." So I said, "It is unusual." He said, "I imagine it is." He wrapped both hands around the teacup. 40 checkpoints is a long time to travel alone. It is the nature of my documentation. Yes. He paused. Dreven's compact issues that kind of documentation for a specific purpose. It's not a transit flag for security reasons. It's a transit flag to prevent diplomatic access. I looked at him. I said, "You are familiar with compact suppression instruments." I served in the Border Adjudication Corps for 14 years before this posting. About every kind of documentation this margin produces. He said it without emphasis. It was not a credential he was deploying. It was context he was offering, the difference being in the flatness of the delivery, the exile flag on your file, the contact restriction pending Dreven's clearance. That's not a security measure. That's a legal muzzle. I said nothing, he said. "I'm not asking you to tell me anything you're not willing to say. Telling you I read the file, and I can see the shape of what it is." He looked at the cup. "I just thought, 40 ports, probably 40 officers who processed you in under 4 minutes, without asking your name. That seemed like a thing worth not repeating. There is a particular kind of Velhari response to an unexpected act of dignity. It is not emotional in the way humans often expect. We do not, as a rule, show a full-faced emotional response to kindness the way some species do. What happens is quieter. There is a realignment, something internal that has been braced against impact for a long time, releasing a fraction of its tension. I felt that now. I did not show it, because I am Velhari and I was on a commissary bench in a contested margine port, and I had been traveling for 11 months. But I felt it. I said, "My name is Vaerith Solen. My rank before the compact's session was Kethavar of the 3rd line of Solen Reach. 3rd line is an inheritance rank. It is the senior warrior rank of my family's governance compact, which the governance compact of Athan Drevan has been attempting to absorb by attrition for 4 years. The exile flag is intended to prevent me from appearing before any diplomatic channel that might certify my family's lineage claim before the absorption is complete." He listened to all of this. He did not write any of it down. He did not reach for a record device. He listened the way a person listens to something they have asked to hear. He said, "Kethavar, I don't know that rank. Most people outside the Reach do not." I paused. It is approximately equivalent to what humans would call a hereditary first commander. Senior line of a governing warrior house. There were 7 such ranks in the Reach. 3 are in exile. 2 have been absorbed and their holders are now nominally under Drevan's authority. 1 died during the resistance campaign 18 months ago, stopped, and 1 is sitting in your commissary eating porridge. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Dale Rourke." He said it the way he had said my name, straightforwardly, as an offering of information. "I've been at this post 11 years. You have been here longer than Drevan's expansion." "Yes. Which is why I know the difference between a security flag and a suppression flag." He drank some of the tea. "Your departure window is in about 2 hours. Where are you trying to get to? I told him the name of the neutral station. The one far enough from the margin that Dravan's compact had no direct enforcement arm there, where there was a Velhari community in the lower transit district. Not official, not organized, but present. Where I had been told, by the second to last person I had spoken to before the exile, that there was a channel. A quiet one. Not a diplomatic transmission. Nothing that could be logged or used as evidence of my attempting to circumvent the compact's contact restriction. Just a channel to the people who were still looking for me. He nodded. He seemed to be doing something internally, that quiet, practical arithmetic of someone figuring something out. He said, that transit route runs through Candescen's secondary departure platform, Platform 7. There's a lineage verification scanner on that platform. It's part of the original port infrastructure from before the margin, disputes. It's been dormant for about 9 years, because most of the species it was designed to verify don't travel through here anymore. He paused. The Velhari Warrior House lineage is one of the registered catalogs in that scanner's base protocol. I had become very still, he said. The dormant scanner still runs its base protocols during standard maintenance cycles. It doesn't transmit those results anywhere, unless it gets a positive match against a record that was registered with the Interstellar Diplomatic Archive before the scanner went dormant. He looked at his tea. If a positive match did occur, hypothetically, the transmission would go directly to the IDA, bypassing the compact's communication filters. Because the registration predates the compact's communication authority in this margin by about 60 years, he set the cup down. That would be a diplomatic record, not something either of us initiated. Just a scanner, doing what it was built to do. I said, you are telling me that I should walk through Platform 7, he said. I'm telling you how the port's infrastructure works. There was a very slight quality to his voice, not amusement exactly, but the close relative of it, in the way of someone who has said something that has a second meaning and is not pretending it doesn't. As a transit officer, it's my obligation to make sure passengers understand which platform their route departs from. I looked at him for a long moment. He met my eyes with the same calm, unhurried steadiness, not triumphant, not conspiratorial, just present. Just a person sitting across commissary table who had read a file closely and then asked if I had eaten. I said, why? He said, why what? You have been at this post 11 years. The file is a standard suppression instrument from a governance compact that has significant enforcement presence in this margin. You have nothing to gain from involving yourself in this. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone calculating an answer. The quiet of someone deciding whether to say the simple true thing or the more complicated thing. That sounds more defensible. He said the simple true thing. You came through 40 checkpoints and nobody asked you your name. That seemed wrong to me. He shrugged once, with the particular economy of a man who does not perform his feelings. I've been processing files in this hall for 11 years, and I have never seen a suppression document applied to a Kethavar. Whatever Dravan's people are trying to accomplish, it involves making sure you don't exist in any official record long enough for anyone to notice. I noticed. He picked up the teacup again. That's all. That was all. He said it the way you say a thing that is both small and complete. I ate the rest of the porridge. We sat in a silence that was for the first time in 11 months, not the silence of a waiting room. I had forgotten that silence could have gradations. That some silences were just two people who had said what needed saying, sitting in the same space without any particular urgency about filling it. He asked me, at some point during that hour, small things. What the reach had looked like before the expansion. Whether the warrior houses had specific festivals or ceremonies he might not know about. He asked these things without the slightly hungry quality that outsider curiosity about other species sometimes has. Not collecting, just asking, in the way of someone who finds the world interesting and has no need to display that interest, I answered. I found, to my own surprise, that I had answers I had not spoken aloud in almost a year, and that speaking them felt like pressing on something that had been compressed for a very long time, and finding it still had its original shape. He asked about the line. The third line of Solan Reach, what it meant in practice, what the 7 Kethavar had each been responsible for. I explained. The structure of the warrior house governance. The way, the lines divided by both region and function. The fact that the third line held the eastern reaches of the homeworld, and therefore also held the major transit corridors, which was why Dreven's people had moved against my line first. Transit corridors. Even in my own house's history, came back to transit, he said. They moved against you first because you control the roads, I said. In essence, yes, he said. That's always how it goes. He said it simply, as a man says something he has seen proven enough times that it has become a kind of flat law of the world. I thought of the 14 years in border adjudication. I thought of what a person accumulates in 14 years of watching borders move and governance, compacts, absorb and suppress and rewrite files and issue suppression instruments for people whose only offense is that they own the roads. I said, you have seen this before. He said, not yours specifically. The pattern. He drank the last of the tea. Pattern is older than either of us. We finished. He stood, took the cups back to the commissary counter. He came back and said that my departure window would open in 40 minutes. And that Platform 7 was the third corridor on the left from the central hub, and that the processing for enter there was automatic and took less than 30 seconds. I stood. I picked up the case. I said his name, Dale Rourke. In the way you say a name when you want to establish it in memory. He looked at me. I said, I have not told anyone my rank since the session. 11 months, he said. I know, I said. You are the first person since the exile to ask me something that was not a procedural question. He said, I know that too. And then, very simply, I hope the channel is there when you get there. I picked up my case and I walked toward the central hub. I heard them before I saw them. 2 of them, wearing the black and gray of Dreven's enforcement arm, the kind that wore civilian trench clothes over the uniform, so that their legal status in neutral ports remained technically ambiguous, a practice so common in the margin that it had its own terminology. They were at the entrance to the third corridor. One of them had a handheld credential reader. I recognized the specific model. It was the kind used to flag suppressed files for secondary detention. The kind that, when it found a match, generated a detention notice that would put me in Port Candescen's holding facility for between 3 and 6 days, while Dreven's people arranged sport. By which time any diplomatic transmission from a dormant scanner would be delayed, reviewed, possibly intercepted. They had known my route. Someone in the documentation chain, the 40 checkpoints of documentation chain, had flagged my transit continuation to Dreven's enforcement network, and they had gotten ahead of me. I stopped. My case was in my right hand. I stood with my weight distributed evenly, as I had learned to stand, and I did the rapid calculation that Velhari do. Not a panic calculation, a tactical one, the kind that had been trained into me since childhood. The third corridor was the only route to Platform 7. There were 2 of them. I was unarmed. The holding facility scenario ended the same way regardless of what I did in the next 30 seconds. I heard footsteps behind me. I did not turn. Because I had developed in 11 months a finely calibrated instinct for the footsteps that meant additional threat, these did not. They were the unhurried footsteps of one person who knew exactly where they were going and was not rushing. Dale Rourke walked past me. He walked directly to the 2 Dreven enforcement officers with the easy, unperformed authority of a man who has worked a port for 11 years and is entirely comfortable in this space and not in any particular hurry. He was carrying a data tablet. He held it out to the officer with the credential reader. He said, Port Authority Maintenance Alert. The credential scanner in this corridor is showing a calibration fault, needs to be pulled offline and recertified before it can be used for official detentions in neutral jurisdiction. He said it with the precise flatness of someone reading from a procedure manual, except that he wasn't reading from anything. He was just speaking in the tone of a man who has issued maintenance alerts before and finds them entirely unremarkable. Any detention initiated using an uncertified scanner in a neutral port is inadmissible under IDE Transit Protocol 47, which means it gets thrown out by the arbitration body, and Port Candescen gets a jurisdictional complaint filed against it. We've had 3 of those in the past 2 years. I'm not having a 4th. He took the tablet back. Recertification takes about 6 hours. Corridor will be open again at third shift. The officer with the credential reader looked at the tablet. He looked at Dale Rourke. He said, "We have a suppression flag transit passenger," Dale Rourke said. "And when this corridor scanner is recertified, you're welcome to process them through it. Until then, I'm afraid I can't let you use it." He said it with the same flat courtesy he had applied to everything since Station 4. No heat, no emphasis, no challenge in the voice. Just the procedural certainty of a man who knows the rules of his port better than anyone else in the building. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. The Dravan officer said, "We'll be filing a protest." "You're welcome to." Dale Rourke had already turned away. He walked back toward the commissary without any apparent interest in their response. I was still standing where I had stopped. He passed me. He did not slow down. He did not look at me. Under his breath, "In the register that does not carry past 2 feet, he said, 30 seconds. Third corridor left. I walked to the third corridor. I walked through the entrance. I walked 30 feet to where the dormant scanner's proximity sensor activated. I could see the panel light up in standby amber, and I stopped in front of it. The scanner was old. It had the design aesthetic of port infrastructure from 60 years ago, when the IDA's expansion into the margin had been ambitious and optimistic and had installed verification systems in every neutral port with the intention that they would be used for generations. Most of them had been decommissioned. This one had been left dormant because Port Candescent had never gotten around to the paperwork. The amber light ran through a brief calibration sequence. Then it found what it was looking for. The light changed from amber to a deep, clear blue, the archive verification color. The color I had not seen since I was a child watching the lineage ceremonies in the Reach, where the Kethavar lines would pass under scanners like this one during the installation of a new holder, and the blue light meant recognized, confirmed, entered into record, a soft tone, 2 notes. The IDA's transmission indicator lit in the corner of the panel. It had found the Selen third line catalog in its base protocol. It had found a match. It was transmitting. I stood very still in the blue light. In the diplomatic record, the one that Dreven's contact restriction could not touch, because the scanner and its registration predated Dreven's communication authority in the margin by 60 years. The following was being logged at that moment, that on this date at Port Candescent, the hereditary lineage verification system of the Interstellar Diplomatic Archive had confirmed the identity and unbroken lineage of Varith Solan, Kethavar of the third line of Solan Reach, exile flagged under Governance Compact Suppression Instrument. Number 471, instrument hereby flagged for IDA review as potentially in conflict with the pre-existing lineage registration agreement of the Velhari warrior. Houses, it would take time. Diplomatic records take time. The IDA review would take weeks. The removal of the suppression instrument would take longer. The exile flag would not come off my documentation tonight, or next week, perhaps for months, but it would be in the record. My name would be in the record, not the exile designation, not the file number, my name, and my rank, and my line, confirmed and transmitted to an archive that predated the man who had erased me and would outlast him. The blue light held for 11 seconds. Then the panel returned to dormant amber, the transmission complete. I stood there for another moment. Breathed. I was Velhari. I did not cry in transit corridors or anywhere else as a general rule, but I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to. In the amber light of a dormant scanner in an old port at the edge of contested space, and I let the weight of 11 months sit in my chest for just that long, before I picked up the case and walked to Platform 7. The departure platform was cold in the way of pressurized loading bays, an ambient chill that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the particular acoustic quality of large metal spaces. My ship was a mid-range transit vessel, 12 passengers, the kind that serviced the neutral stations beyond the margin. I had a berth ticket and a stamped transit continuation and a diplomatic transmission in the IDA archive and no rank on any document that anyone in the margin would recognize tonight. I thought about this as I walked the boarding ramp. I thought about a man sitting in a commissary asking a transit passenger if she had eaten. I thought about 14 years in border adjudication, and 11 years in a contested margin port, and the particular flat calm of someone who has seen the pattern enough times to know it by sight. I thought about the word he had used, wrong, that it seemed wrong to him, not illegal, irregular, not a procedural anomaly. Wrong. The word of a person who still uses that category to describe things. After 11 years of watching what this margin does to people, I thought he will file a maintenance alert for a scanner that has no fault. He will have to answer for it to the Drevan officers when they file their protest. He will have to account for the calibration hold to his supervisors. He has worked this port for 11 years. He knows what he has set in motion. He asked anyway. I was at the top of the boarding ramp when I heard my name. I turned. He was at the base of the ramp. He had not followed me through the corridor. He must have come around through the service access. Perhaps he simply knew this platform the way he knew every part of the port. The way you know a space you have inhabited for 11 years. Every door and every shortcut and every way a ramp connects to a concourse. He was standing there in the orange light of the loading bay, with his hands in his pockets and the slightly settled look of a man who has done what he came to do and is not requiring acknowledgement for it. He said, Fareth Solon, Kethavar of the third line. He said it as a complete sentence, not a question. The way you say a name when you want the person to hear it said correctly before they go. I said Dale Rourke. I let his name sit in the air the same way he had let mine sit. He looked at me, the calm brown eyes, the weathered face, the absolute absence of any performance in his expression. He said, the channel will be there. I did not ask how he knew that. Maybe he didn't know it. Maybe he was saying the thing you say when you want a true thing to be true, which is its own kind of knowledge. I said, when the IDA review concludes. He said, you don't owe me anything. I said, I know. I stood at the top of the ramp for a moment. Among the Velhari, when a warrior householder is recognized by an outsider, formally recognized, their line spoken aloud and acknowledged. The holder's house incurs a debt of hospitality. It is not a transactional debt. It cannot be repaid with goods or money or a favor returned. I paused. It means that if Dale Rourke ever comes to Solan Reach, he comes to a door that is open. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've never been to the Reach. No. I picked up the case. You should. I walked down the boarding ramp. The ship's hatch sealed behind me. The loading bay's orange light narrowed to a strip and then closed. And I was in the metal quiet of the transit vessel. And the engines were beginning their low-frequency warm-up that you feel in the soles of your feet before you hear it. I found my berth. I sat. The ship lifted. Through the narrow viewport, the port fell away below me. The dark reddish-brown stone. The rounded corners, worn smooth by the desert wind. The orderly grid of the departure platforms. The lights of the processing hall. At this altitude, it looked like a small, orderly thing set in the immensity of the desert, which is what it was. A small place where people who were in transit stopped temporarily and were processed and moved on. I had been in transit for 11 months. I was still in transit. The exile flag was still on my documentation. My rank was still stripped in every record that Drevan's compact controlled, which was most of the records in the margin. But in the IDA archive, which was not most records, and was older than the margin, and would be there, after the margin had changed shape 3 more times, there was a transmission, a scanner's confirmation, a lineage certified and entered into permanent record by a piece of old port infrastructure that had been waiting for 60 years to be useful. My name, in the record, my line, spoken aloud by a dormant machine that an officer with calm brown eyes had told me to walk past. I did not know, then, how long the review would take. I know now, it took 4 months and 11 days, and the suppression instrument was struck from my documentation in a formal IDA ruling that Drevan's compact was not able to overturn because the lineage registration was 60 years old, and the compact's legal standing in the margin did not extend to IDA pre-existing agreements. I know that the ruling generated a diplomatic acknowledgement that required the reinstated rank to be entered into the transit records of every port in the margin within 30 days. I know that it was entered into the records of Port Candescent on a Tuesday, and that the officer on duty who processed the acknowledgement and updated the port's records was a human man 11 years into his posting, signed the acknowledgement with a steady hand, and filed it without fanfare. I know these things because when the ruling came, I arranged to be notified of each step of the process, and I arranged to be notified of the Port Candace filing specifically, and I watched it happen from the neutral station beyond the margin where the channel had indeed been there. I also know that a Valhari diplomatic messenger arrived at Port Candace 7 weeks after the ruling, carrying a formal house recognition document from the reinstated third line of Solan Reach. Not a letter, not a message. The specific kind of document that a Kethaver's house issues when a formal debt of hospitality has been recorded, and the house wants the recipient to have a copy they can show at any Valhari-administered checkpoint without being asked to explain it. I am told he read it the same way he read everything, carefully, completely, without hurry, and then folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. I'm told, he said, tell her thank you, and tell her the porridge has gotten better. The messenger did not entirely understand the reference. I did. There is a particular stillness that settles into you on the other side of 40 checkpoints, when the 41st one turns out to be the one that sees you. It is not triumph. Hurt. Valhari do not dwell in triumph any more than we dwell in self-pity. It is something quieter and more durable than triumph. It is the knowledge that a thing you thought had been erased was not erased, that it was in the record, as it had always been in the record, and that it had only needed one person to read closely enough to find it. One person who asked if you had eaten. That is all. That is the whole of it.